Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sigma 20 to 200mm f3.5 to 6.3 DG, a super zoom lens that starts off unusually wide. It's available in Sony E or Leica L mounts. Announced in September 2025 and costing around $1,000 or £800, the 2200 delivers a flexible 10 times optical range, taking you from here all the way to here, or from here to here, or here to here. It's ideal for general use or travel when you only want to carry one lens. Now, super zoom lenses are of course not uncommon, but most start at 24 or 28mm. In contrast, the new Sigma starts at an ultra-wide 20mm, making it unique against rivals. Now, a few millimeters may not sound like much, but it does make a big difference at the wide end. Here's what you're going to see at 28mm, for example. It's nice and wide for sure, but now here's what you get at 20mm, capturing a substantially wider field of view. The new Sigma gives you this while including the popular focal lengths at 28, 35, 50, 85, 100, 135 and 200mm, covering you for pretty much every situation. And if you need even more reach, most modern cameras have got sufficient resolution for some cropping later on. It's also really flexible for video. Here's the lens at 20mm f3.5, a great focal length for handheld vlogging, capturing plenty of your surroundings. And now at 200mm f6.3, where with a quick twist of the zoom ring, you could be capturing close-ups of birds, animals, or nearby sports. Pretty compelling stuff, but first, are any of you into coffee? If so, you might enjoy my latest channel, cleverly titled Gordon Gets Coffee, where I make videos about great places to enjoy quality coffee all around the world. And that's my advert over, so now let's get on with the review. Let's start with the design. The 20 to 200 measures 77mm in diameter, 116mm long and weighs 550 grams. It's a member of Sigma's more affordable contemporary series, but still built in Japan, and includes weather sealing at the mount with a rubber grommet. The controls start with a wide ribbed zoom ring which extends the barrel by about 70mm and is sufficiently damped to avoid creeping back when pointed directly up or down. Next come two switches, one for auto and manual focus, and the other to lock the barrel, but only in the shortest 20mm position, and that's for transportation, although again I didn't experience it extending by itself by accident. Finally, at the end is a free spinning manual focusing ring, motor assisted as usual and nice and smooth in operation. Meanwhile, the filter thread measures 72mm and Sigma supplies a small petal hood that twists onto a bayonet at the end. Obviously, to accommodate 20mm ultra-wide coverage at one end though, the hood has to be quite short and it's not going to be providing too much protection. There's also no optical stabilisation, so you're going to need a body with IBIS to iron out any wobbles. And as a third-party lens, it won't support hybrid zoom or cropless stabilisation on Lumix bodies, while on Sony bodies the burst speed is going to be limited to 15 frames per second with continuous AF. It's also not optically parfocal, which means you will briefly lose focus as you zoom through the range, especially if you do it quickly. Now, this can be a bit distracting on videos and also means you may miss some shots if you're zooming during a burst, but it's not going to be an issue if you adjust the zoom before you start shooting or if you're only making small or slow adjustments. Meanwhile, the aperture, like most super zoom lenses, is variable with a maximum of f3.5 at 20mm and f6.3 at 200mm. But it is always revealing to see exactly where that aperture changes. For example, you're only going to enjoy f3.5 at 20mm, as the moment you start turning that zoom ring, the aperture begins to dim. So at 24mm, you're going to be at f4, at 31mm, you'll be at 4.5, and at 40mm, you'll be at f5. At 63mm, you're going to reach f5.6, then at 130mm onwards, you're going to dim to the minimum aperture of f6.3. Now, this understandably limits your opportunities for shallow depth of field effects, although if you can exploit the decent close focusing capabilities, some blurring, as you'll see, will be possible. Okay, my first test demonstrates the focusing for photos roughly midway through the range at 135mm 6.3. I'm using the L mount version here on a Lumix S12 body, where you can see the focusing is pretty snappy. It proved equally fast across the entire focal range. Now here's how it looks for video at 20mm 3.5, tracking me around the scene. 20mm is great for video presentations when you're close to the camera and you need to capture lots of your surroundings. This also makes it an ideal focal length for handheld vlogging, again capturing a broad field of view without the person becoming too large in the frame, even when the camera's held at arm's length. Plus it's wide enough to accommodate the crops of digital stabilization if you need a bit of extra compensation. Zoom the lens to a standard focal length of 50mm and you're at an ideal length for presenting pieces to camera or taking close range portraits. At this point though, the aperture has dimmed to f5.3, so there's not going to be much blurring in the background from this distance. If you really want to minimize distractions though, here's how it looks at 200mm 6.3, and this also works as a preview of my portrait photo test later on in the review. But first, a quick focus breathing test starting back at 20mm and manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. Here you'll see the field of view widen a little bit as you focus closer. Zoom to roughly midway through the optical range though, here at 85mm, and the breathing is virtually eliminated as you rack the focus from far to near and back again. From this point on, breathing remains pretty well behaved as seen here at the longest focal length of 200mm. Next, for my quality test, starting with a distant landscape scene, bright and peer, angled so that details run right into the corners. Again, I tested the L-mount version, but here on a Lumix S1R2 body, but the optical results also apply to the Sony E-mount version. I'll start at 20mm 3.5, and taking a closer look in the middle, where the lens was focused, shows nice sharp details with nothing really to complain about. As I close the aperture, there's little to be gained, although at f8 and smaller apertures, diffraction will begin to soften the image. So back to the 3.5 sample before heading into the corners. I'd say the lens impressively maintains most of the detail that you saw in the middle, with only fractional softness due to perhaps the profile correcting the geometry. There's also a little darkening due to vignetting, but again it's not too bad, and as I close the aperture it gradually disappears by f5.6. Now let's take a look at the lens at 50mm at its maximum aperture of f5.3. No, I also have results at 28, 35mm and others, and we'll try to include them all in the download at a later point. Keep an eye on the description for an update. So now let's take a closer look in the middle of the frame where things are looking nice and crisp, and there's no benefit to detail by closing it any further. So now let's head into the corner of the f5.3 sample, where pixel peepers may notice a minor reduction in sharpness, but it's not bad at all and there's also minimal vignetting. Close the aperture to f8 though, and the details crispen up with a boost in contrast too. Now to avoid this video becoming too long, I'm going to skip straight to 200mm now, although again I'll try to make the in-between focal lengths available as a download. So you're looking at 200mm f6.3 here, and taking a close look in the middle shows plenty of fine detail. Closing the aperture further won't bring you any benefits in the middle of the frame. Head into the corners at 200mm 6.3 and you will notice a little softening as well as a little coloured fringing too. Close the aperture and both are improved a little, but it's not as crisp in the corners as at shorter focal lengths. That said, many shots at the longer end of the lens are going to be concentrating on a more central subject, so you may actually rarely notice. Now let's see how the lens performs for portraits, with the range giving plenty of flexibility at least in terms of coverage and distance. First here at 50mm 5.3, where the background unsurprisingly isn't particularly blurred, but at least the details are nice and sharp. Next at 85mm f6.1, where you can begin to reduce the area captured in the background to reduce distractions, but again not a great deal of blur. But the details are still nice and sharp. And now at 200mm 6.3, where you can further reduce the coverage in the background, making up in some part for the modest opportunities for blurring. This modest maximum aperture of a super zoom lens is really their downside versus a brighter prime or even a shorter zoom. You're trading the chance for greater background blur for the flexibility of a broader zoom range and the chance to reach reasonably far. The choice, dear viewer, is yours. 200mm is also ideal for larger birds and animals, as seen here with Steven Seagal and friends. Get reasonably close and you'll enjoy a little bit of blurring in the background. Coupled with a recent body, it's also more than capable of capturing moving subjects, such as birds in flight or nearby sports. 200mm is also long enough to reach many subjects, especially if you don't mind cropping. But at f6.3, again, you're not going to be getting much blurring in the background, unless the subject gets very close. The 20-200 isn't just about capturing distant subjects though. In this next section you'll see just how good it can be for close-ups, starting with my bokeh ball test at 20mm 3.5. Now this was taken near to the minimum focusing distance, where I could get close enough to turn those fairy lights into small bokeh blobs. As expected from a super zoom optical design, there is a little outlining and some textures within, but they're not looking too bad here, and as I close the aperture, the shape of the diaphragm system mostly keeps out of the way. Next at 50mm 5.3, again from the minimum focusing distance, where the lens has delivered some pretty respectable bokeh blobs. not to mention a decent degree of magnification. That star at the top of the ornament is only 4 centimeters wide. The blobs are nice and round across the frame and only exhibiting minor outlining and textures within, so a good result for this type of lens. As I close the aperture, you will begin to see some geometric shapes from the diaphragm system, but they're quite subtle. So next to 100mm f6.3, where I could still focus on the subject without moving further away. This represented the maximum magnification I achieved with the lens, approximately 1 to 2 or 50%. This in turn has also delivered the biggest bokeh balls, although at the cost of some vignetting in this particular scenario, with some of those blobs towards the corners appearing chopped off. As I close the aperture, this effect is reduced until it disappears at f11, and even though there's some geometric shapes here, the result is still looking pretty good. And finally at 200mm f6.3, where I've had to position the camera further away to achieve focus. The longer focal length hasn't compensated though, and the result is a lower magnification with a smaller subject and smaller bokeh balls, plus that vignette that we saw previously in the corners. But still, these are looking pretty good for a super zoom lens in terms of minimizing outlines and textures. And as I close the aperture, you'll see how they adjust. But the lesson here is the 20-200 can be a surprisingly good lens for close-up work, and you'll enjoy the greatest magnification or reproduction with it zoomed between about 80 and 100mm. Set this focal length on the lens and then get as close as you can to your subject for some pretty dramatic results. Now it's time for my final verdict, during which I'm going to show you more photos taken with the lens, including some of those close-ups. Sigma's 20-200mm is an attractive option for anyone looking for a super zoom lens. The 10x optical range will cover most situations, from expansive landscapes or tight interiors to portraits or even nearby sports and wildlife. What makes it really different from most existing super zoom lenses though is the ultra wide starting point of 20mm versus the more common 24 or 28mm. Now a few millimeters may not sound like much, but at the wide end it makes a significant difference to your field of view. 28mm is a fairly mild wide angle. 24 is much more useful, but 20 is genuinely ultra wide, greatly increasing the flexibility and potential drama. After all, you can crop any zoom at the long end to increase its effective reach, but you can't make the view any wider at the short end, at least without resorting to generative AI. Now none of this would matter if the quality wasn't any good, but Sigma's done another great job with the lens here, which in my test delivered sharp details pretty much across the frame and throughout the range. It can also focus really close in order to deliver 1 to 2 or 50% reproduction, between around 80 and 100mm in focal length, and that greatly extends its overall flexibility. On the downside, the aperture is unsurprisingly fairly modest, dimming from f3.5 the moment you start turning the zoom ring. And this in turn means you're not going to get much background blur at any focal length unless you get really close to your subject. But to be fair, that's the same story for most super zoom lenses, and it's the compromise you have to decide upon. Ultimately, a super zoom lens is about flexibility, and the Sigma 20-200 becomes the most compelling model I've tested to date. The chance to zoom considerably wider than those that start at 28 or even 24 is a major benefit, while the close focusing capabilities are a nice bonus. Couple this with decent quality for much the same price as a typical 28-200 or 24-200, and I'd say you've got a winner on your hands. And that's it for this review. As always, if you found it useful, I'd love for you to give it a like and consider checking out some of my other videos. Plus, if you're into coffee, you may also enjoy my cafe reviews on my new Gordon Gets Coffee channel. Pop over and check it out. So let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.